But
Mr. Washington, I believe you. But at the end of the day, that's the fundamental problem. For this administration to nominate someone as FAA administrator who can't answer the question why were 346 people killed in horrific crashes that resulted in the 737 MAX being grounded for a long time is striking.
Someone walked into that hearing room thinking their resume was enough. Someone in that chair had no idea what was about to happen. Every question was a door, and behind every door, nothing. Watch what gets exposed when nobody checks the qualifications.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Washington, you've emphasized your time as CEO of the Denver Airport, 20 months. Have you ever flown a plane?
thank you for the question, Senator. No, I have never flown a plane.
So you weren't a military pilot or a commercial airline pilot?
No, Senator.
Have you ever worked for an airline?
No, Senator.
Have you ever worked as an air traffic controller?
No, Senator.
You ever worked for a company that manufactures airplanes?
No, Senator.
You ever worked for a company that fixes airplanes?
No, Senator.
So for 20 months, you've been in charge of the Denver airport. You're in charge of the airport's buildings, correct?
I am in charge of everything that goes on at that airport.
Okay, well, I'm not sure that's exactly right. You're in charge of parking at the airport, is that correct? How many parking spaces are there at the Denver airport?
Thousands.
Okay, you're in charge of all the shops and restaurants in the airport. How many restaurants are there in the Denver airport?
We have anywhere from 150 to 200 or so.
You're in charge of coffee shops and clothing stores and newsstands. You're not in charge of the pilots, are you?
No, Senator.
You're not in charge of the airplane mechanics, are you?
No, Senator.
You're not in charge of the air traffic controllers, are you?
No, Senator.
You know, I look at prior FAA administrators. You and I talked a couple of days ago. I respect your military service. I look at prior FAA administrators. Current acting FAA administrator Billy Nolan was a commercial airline pilot. He worked at multiple airlines in management roles. He has certificates in aviation safety from 3 different institutions, from the U.S. Army Safety Center and the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. That's under President Biden. Administrator Steve Dixon, under both Biden and Trump, was an Air Force fighter pilot, a commercial airline pilot, an executive at Delta Airlines, 40 years of aviation experience. Acting Administrator Daniel Elwell was an Air Force combat pilot, a commercial airline pilot, a senior FAA official, and an aviation industry executive. Administrator Randy Babbitt was a commercial airline pilot for 25 years and served as the president of a labor union for pilots. Those are all people who know something about aviation and safety. As I look at your record, I see a record where you've got experience with buses, you've got experience with trains. Buses and trains are very different from planes. My understanding is this administration previously considered you for the board of Amtrak. That could well have been a position you were qualified for, and you might well have received bipartisan support to serve in that role. You know, a lot of discussion, quite rightly, has focused on the horrific crashes of the 737 MAX that took 346 souls from us. Let me ask you, Mr. Washington, what is an angle of attack sensor?
The angle of attack sensor is a sensor that is on the front of the plane that controls the tilt and the altitude of the plane.
And how many of them are there on a 737 MAX?
I believe 2.
And what systems are there if there are contradictory signals from the angle of attack sensor?
What systems are there?
Yeah.
I would say the MCAS system, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. The MCAS system is responsible for the crashes at issue. What happens?
This is the moment the mask comes off, not because Cruz is grandstanding, but because the math is undeniable. 346 people died. The crashes had a specific cause. The cause had a specific name, and the man nominated to prevent the next one cannot explain any of it. This isn't about party. This is about what happens when a specialized safety role gets treated like a political reward. The FAA administrator controls the airspace above every American city. pilots, mechanics, certification standards, all of it flows through that office. When that office is held by someone who manages parking lots and coffee shops, the question isn't political, it's existential. Drop one word in the comments, qualified or not, and tell me what standard you think this job should require.
When you get a different reading from two different sensors.
Can you repeat that question, Senator?
What happens when you get a different reading from two different angle of attack sensors?
Well, I think human reaction needs to take over if that occurs.
So why did that not happen on the Lion Air and Ethiopian Air flights?
Well, Senator, I'm not a pilot. I don't know if I can answer that particular question.
Mr. Washington, I believe you.
Huh?
But at the end of the day, that's the fundamental problem. For this administration to nominate someone as FAA administrator who can't answer the question, why were 346 people killed in horrific crashes that result in the 737 MAX being grounded for a long time, is striking. By the way, Administrator Dixon, after the FAA recertified the 737 MAX, he went and flew it personally. Mm-hmm. Listen, let me be clear, and you and I talked about this. FAA administrator is a specialized position. I'm not qualified to be FAA administrator. I have no idea how to fly a plane. No one in their right mind would put me in charge of aviation safety because I don't have that experience. I suspect most of the members of this committee are in a similar position. The American people, when they think about aviation safety, when they think about, I played in this committee, a Southwest Airlines and FedEx plane almost colliding at Austin's airport. They want an FAA administrator who knows why those planes crash and knows how to fix it to keep them safe. And with all respect, Mr. Washington, it gives no comfort to the flying public that their pilot might be a transgendered witch, but doesn't actually know how to prevent the plane from crashing into the ground and killing them. I believe your record is woefully lacking. And in fact, you have zero aviation safety experience. And I don't believe you'll have the votes for confirmation, as you and I visited about earlier this week.
346 people never came home, and the man nominated to make sure it never happens again just admitted, on the record, under oath, that he cannot tell you why they died. That is not a political talking point. That is what happened in that room. Here is what most coverage will do with this clip. They will sort it by party. They will find a Democrat to say Cruz was grandstanding. They will find a Republican to say the nomination was reckless. They will balance it, package it, and move on. And the actual question, the only question that matters, will never get asked in prime time. The question is this: how does someone with zero aviation experience end up as the nominee for the top aviation safety job in the United States? That answer is not complicated. It is uncomfortable. The FAA administrator position sat vacant. The Biden administration needed a nomination. Phil Washington had a profile: military veteran, transit CEO, a record of managing large public infrastructure operations. On paper, for a general leadership role, that profile reads well. The problem is that the FAA is not a general leadership role. It is one of the most technically specific regulatory positions in the federal government. The people who held it before him flew the planes. They fixed the planes. They spent decades inside the system they were then asked to oversee. Washington managed the Denver airport for 20 months. He oversaw the parking, the restaurants, the shops. That is not a knock on the man. Those are genuinely complex operations. But the air traffic controllers at Denver Airport do not report to the airport CEO. The mechanics do not report to him. The pilots certainly do not. The technical core of aviation safety, the part that determines whether a plane falls out of the sky, was never inside his jurisdiction. And Cruz knew that. Every question in that sequence was surgical. Have you flown a plane? Have you worked for an airline? Have you worked as an air traffic controller? Each no was a brick being removed from the wall. By the time he got to the angle of attack sensor question, the wall was already gone. But here is what nobody is asking. Why did this nomination make it this far? Washington's nomination had been in process long enough for hearings to be scheduled, briefings to be conducted, and a confirmation vote to be anticipated. That means people inside the administration reviewed this record and decided it was sufficient. That means someone looked at the gap between the role's requirements and the nominee's experience and concluded it was bridgeable. That decision, made quietly, in rooms with no cameras, is the real story. Think about what this means if you are a pilot. You have spent years earning certifications, logging hours, learning the exact systems that the MCAS failure exploited. You know what an angle of attack sensor does because your life depends on it. And the person nominated to set the safety standards for your profession cannot answer a basic technical question about the crash that grounded the most controversial aircraft in modern aviation history. Think about what this means if you lost someone on one of those flights. The 737 MAX crashes were not random. Lion Air 610, Ethiopian Airlines 302, a combined 346 people. The MCAS system, designed to compensate for engine placement changes, received faulty data from a single angle of attack sensor and forced the nose of the plane down repeatedly. Pilots fought it. They lost. The reason they lost is because they were not told the system existed. They were not trained on how to override it. Boeing knew. The FAA certified it anyway. The system failed. People died. That is the specific, documented technical failure that the next FAA administrator is supposed to have learned from and built safeguards against. When Cruz asked what happens when two angle of attack sensors give contradictory readings, Washington said human reaction needs to take over. That is not wrong as a general principle, but it is precisely the wrong answer for this specific crash, because the pilots on those flights did try to react. The system overpowered them. The detail Cruz was testing for, whether Washington understood the MCAS override procedure, the crew alerting failures, the certification gap, never came. Washington said, "I'm not a pilot. I don't know if I can answer that question." Cruz said, "I believe you." And that belief, genuine, not sarcastic, was the most damaging line in the entire exchange. Because it meant the argument was over. There was nothing left to dispute. If you are finding this level of analysis somewhere else right now, drop the source in the comments, because most coverage of this hearing stopped at the clip and never went one layer deeper. The broader consequence is this. Aviation safety in the United States is not theoretical. There are roughly 45,000 flights per day in American airspace. The FAA sets the standards for every single one of them. Certification, training requirements, maintenance protocols, near-miss reporting systems, all of it runs through that office. When that office is led by someone who does not understand the technical baseline of what they are regulating, the risk does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly until something goes wrong. Cruz said something near the end that was easy to dismiss because of the way it was framed. He said the American people want an FAA administrator who knows why those planes crashed and knows how to fix it. That line, stripped of everything else around it, is the only standard that should matter for this job. Whether Washington would have grown into the role, surrounded himself with the right technical advisors, and built competency through proximity, that is a fair argument. Leaders do not always need to be the most technical person in the room. But the FAA administrator is not a general executive position. It is closer to a chief medical officer than a chief executive officer. You need to understand the medicine. This story is not finished. The vote has not happened. The vacancy remains a live political and public safety issue. And the question of what standard America holds for the people who keep its skies safe, that question does not resolve with one hearing. It resolves with outcomes. And outcomes, in aviation, are measured in whether people land or do not. If this breakdown gave you something the headline didn't, subscribe, share it with someone who flies, and drop your take in the comments. What standard should the FAA administrator actually be required to meet? The conversation is open.